But we accept this as part of the standard narrative because it's the story we've all been told. And then all of a sudden it re-emerges. Again in England, we see the signing of the Magna Carta. And for a handful of centuries, we see the unfolding story of kind of the birth of the Parliament and so on. We then see the American Declaration of Independence. We see the French Revolution. And then the last sort of 200-300 years have been told as if they're the sort of triumphant march of the Western liberal model of democracy, particularly following the Second World War, and then the Cold War. We see that democracy becomes kind of today the preeminent method of human governance, and one that is familiar to most people across the world, and is usually preferred by most people across the world, particularly, interestingly, those who don't have it. Of course, what we've tried to do here in The Secret History is to point out a number of kind of flaws with this traditional model of what democracy is and where it comes from, this standard history, as we've called it. Firstly, the first and most obvious thing is that it's a very Western story. Really, this is the story of Western civilization. It's the story of the triumph of the West. We start in ancient Greece, we have Rome, then we have England, America, France, and so on, the modern colonial period, the conquering of the world, and right up until the triumph at the end of the First and then Second World War, and then the Cold War. This is very much the story of Western civilization as is told by those who won it. But what we have to ask at this point is, how can non-Westerners engage with this story? How do people in non-Western quarters of the world engage with this very Eurocentric vision of what democracy is and where it comes from? If it's only happened in Greece or Rome or England or America or France, and then that model has been spread out to the world, then it becomes quite problematic. It becomes kind of part of Western civilization. It becomes attached to the story of that civilization and its emergence and its dominance today. And, it doesn't take into account that other people may have done democracy in quite different ways, perhaps, to it's been done in the West, but certainly have done it recurringly throughout their history, and that they have their own narratives and their own histories and their own stories that have at least nominally democratic mechanisms, ideas within them. This isn't a new idea. Of course, the idea that, what's most interesting about this is that the story of Western civilization itself, we know, is problematic because it's embedded with these very deep discourses about, if you like, Western exceptionalism, that it's kind of the pinnacle of human civilization, and so on. And underneath that are two kind of competing ideas that are important here, and that is that the West has a unique proclivity for democracy, and that the Orient is prone to despotism. And that even today we still have this idea is still very much embedded into the way that we view where democracy can happen and where it won't happen, and we continue to understand it as something that the West has a very strong drive towards, that Western society and Western civilization are egalitarian and democratic and so on and so on, but Eastern cultures and Afro-Asiatic cultures, if you like, non-Western civilization, just can't do it. They're too primitive, they're too backward, they're too barbaric, and they're simply incapable of understanding or having the cultural practices or whatever it is needed in order to do democracy. And what we're arguing here is that one of the reasons we continue to think this is because democracy is told as if it's a Western thing, as if it only comes from the West, that it's only a Grecian invention, that it only happened at the French or American revolutions, that it only occurred in these certain Western historical epochs. And when you tell it like that, it's no wonder that we view it as a Western thing, and that we view that the Afro-Asiatic world can't do democracy, and that people in the Afro-Asiatic world sometimes agree with that, It's not an uncommon sentiment there either. There are often people saying, for example, in Iraq, there are many Iraqis who would say Iraq will never be a democracy because we have no history and no culture of democracy. Well, this is completely flawed. If you look at Iraqi history and culture, for example, just one amongst the many you could choose from the Afro-Asiatic world, then you'll find that through their long and complex political history, there are moments where people have been engaged in their governance and have played a direct and important role in their own societies, and there is a democratic history there. There is a democratic impetus. So I think that this is very important.
What impact might this new evidence have in current politics?
Well, I think Steve and I, from the very beginning, were very excited by the kind of historical implications of this and the sort of philosophical implications of this, if you like, to the broader debate about what democracy is and where it comes from. But and we sort of saw it as an intellectual exercise, if you like. But from the very beginning, we also saw it as something with definite pragmatic and practical political applications. In fact, our argument really is that by acknowledging that democracy has a much broader and deeper history than is usually conceded, we can get away from notions which suggest it is an exclusively Western thing and doesn't work in Western societies. And what we're saying here, and this is tapping into what I was saying before, that when people engage with their own democratic histories, when people for example, in any given Afro-Asiatic context, look into their own myths or epics, their own customs and traditions, or their own ways of doing governance at a tribal or a local or even a state level, people all over the world may come to feel a stronger sense of ownership over democracy, rather than kind of having to read, the Athenian Aristotle, for example, right, and sort of say, well, here's this thing that the Greeks did all these years ago, rather than having to read the Declaration of Independence, or rather than having to read, contemporary Western intellectuals about what democracy is and where it comes from. If people across the non-Western world are able to look inside their own histories and able to hold them up to scrutiny and to look for moments when they were doing democracy in even their most ancient history through to their more contemporary history, and if they're able to unearth these moments and bring them into kind of popular parlance and make them part of political discourse and historical discourse, then, democracy will no longer seem this kind of foreign Western exercise that is futile in the Afro-Asiatic world, but instead something that is indigenous, that comes from here, that has a legitimate part of our own history. And by tapping into that, you can use that as a powerful discourse to bring people to the polls, to bring people to want to be engaged in governance, to bring people to want to participate in their own system, and to want to get rid of corruption and nepotism and all of these kind of anti-democratic forces that exist. This is really one of the problems, that this narrative, this sort of a mistaken history of democracy, this erroneous assumption that democracy is this Western idea, continues, I argue, to have a major impact over the way that people in non-Western civilization view democracy and the way that they engage with it.